studying your last two. I swim med when they turned in. The styrene down to mute. And can learn the pole that sunk he died.
As a business becomes successful, it usually begins accumulating retained earnings. At first, this seems like great news. The company is profitable, cash is building up, and the business owner is creating wealth. But this success also introduces a new risk that many business owners don't immediately recognize. In this example, Randy owns an operating company that has earned $100,000 of profit each year. After several years, the corporation has accumulated $500,000 of retained earnings. The problem is that all of this money is still sitting inside the operating company. Now look at the warning icons surrounding the business. An operating company faces many potential risks during its normal operations. It could be sued by a customer, face a professional liability claim, become involved in a contract dispute, or have creditors seeking payment. These are all common business risks that every corporation may encounter. If one of these events occurs, the corporation's assets could become vulnerable. Since the retained earnings are still inside the operating company, they may also be exposed to creditor claims. In other words, the wealth that took years to build could potentially be at risk because it remains inside the same entity that conducts the business operations. The illustration on the right demonstrates this danger. The company building represents the operating company, while the safe inside it represents the accumulated retained earnings. If the operating company is successfully sued, creditors may attempt to access those assets to satisfy their claims. This leads us to an important tax planning principle. As a corporation grows, protecting accumulated wealth becomes just as important as generating new profits. Earning money is only half of the equation. Preserving that wealth for the business owner is equally important. In the next slide, we'll see how Canadian tax planning uses a holding company, or Holdco, to separate accumulated wealth from business risk, creating one of the most common and effective asset protection strategies for corporate owner-managers. Now that we've identified the problem, let's look at one of the most common solutions used in Canadian corporate tax planning: the holding company, often called a Holdco. At the top of the slide, notice the new corporate structure. Instead of the business owner owning only the operating company, a holding company is placed above the operating company. The owner owns the Holdco, and the Holdco, in turn, owns the operating company. This creates two separate corporations, each serving a different purpose. The operating company, or OpCo, continues to run the day-to-day business. It earns revenue, pays expenses, employs staff, and carries all of the normal business risks. The holding company, on the other hand, is generally used to hold accumulated wealth rather than conduct business operations. Now look at the flow of money in the center of the slide. As profits accumulate inside the operating company, those retained earnings can be paid to the holding company as an intercorporate dividend. Because the corporations are connected, these dividends are generally received by the Holdco without additional corporate tax at the time of the transfer. This allows the accumulated cash to be moved from the business operating environment into a separate corporation. The comparison at the bottom highlights why this structure is so valuable. Before using a Holdco, all of the retained earnings remain inside the operating company, where they may be exposed to business risks such as lawsuits or creditor claims. After introducing the Holdco, the accumulated wealth is separated from the operating business. Even though the operating company continues carrying on business and accepting normal commercial risks, the retained earnings have already been transferred into the holding company, where they are generally outside the day-to-day business risk of the operating company. The key principle is simple, but extremely powerful. Let the operating company focus on running the business, while the holding company focuses on protecting accumulated wealth. By separating business operations from long-term assets, corporate owners gain an additional layer of protection and greater flexibility for future tax planning. In the next slide, we'll explore why a Holdco is much more than an asset protection tool. It also provides important advantages for investing retained earnings, lending funds back to the operating company when needed, and supporting long-term tax and retirement planning. We've now seen how a holding company can protect accumulated retained earnings. But a Holdco is much more than an asset protection structure. It is also a powerful long-term tax planning and wealth management tool. Let's start with the timeline at the top of the slide. Each year, the operating company earns profits through its normal business activities. Instead of allowing those profits to accumulate indefinitely inside the operating company, they can be transferred to the holding company as intercorporate dividends. Over time, the operating company remains relatively lean, while the holding company steadily builds a pool of protected wealth. Now you might wonder, what happens if the operating company needs money again in the future? That's where another important planning advantage comes into play. The holding company can lend money back to the operating company whenever additional cash is required. This allows the business to continue operating while keeping ownership of the accumulated wealth within the corporate group. To further strengthen this arrangement, the loan can be secured using a general security agreement, commonly called a GSA. This legal agreement gives the holding company priority over many other creditors if the operating company later experiences financial difficulties. In other words, the holding company is often in a much stronger position to recover the money it has lent. Beyond asset protection, a Holdco provides several additional benefits. First, it allows retained earnings to be moved outside the day-to-day business risks of the operating company. Second, intercorporate dividends generally allow those funds to move between connected corporations without triggering additional corporate tax at the time of the transfer. Third, the holding company can invest those accumulated profits, allowing wealth to continue growing over many years. It also provides greater flexibility for managing corporate cash flow and can support future compensation and retirement planning strategies. The illustration at the bottom brings all of these ideas together. The business owner builds a successful operating company, transfers accumulated wealth into the holding company, allows those investments to grow over time, and eventually uses that wealth to support retirement and future family planning. This is why experienced tax advisors often recommend establishing a holding company before significant retained earnings accumulate. A Holdco is not simply a defensive structure for protecting assets. It becomes a central part of a long-term strategy for preserving wealth, creating investment opportunities, improving financial flexibility, and supporting the owner's future financial goals.